Nobody spirals in a straight line, and nobody spirals visibly. And that combination is exactly why the person who left an avoidant almost never gets to see what actually happens next. The spiral is real. It's measurable, predictable, almost clinical in how consistently it unfolds once someone an avoidant depended on, without ever admitting the depending, is simply gone. But it happens in rooms nobody else enters, in silences nobody else hears, in thoughts an avoidant would rarely, if ever, say out loud to another living person. Which means the widespread assumption that walking away from an avoidant leaves them relatively untouched, while the person who left suffers alone, is almost always exactly backwards. What follows is not speculation designed to make anyone feel better about a difficult decision. It's a description of a well-documented psychological pattern, the specific, often invisible unravelling that tends to occur inside someone who spent years avoiding vulnerability, once the person who used to absorb the cost of that avoidance is no longer there to absorb it. This unravelling touches identity, cognition, physical functioning, and future relationships. And understanding it in full offers something valuable to anyone who has spent months wondering, in the silence that followed a breakup, whether any of it actually mattered on the other side. Before going further, it's worth being honest about something uncomfortable, because false comfort tends to do more damage than clear information ever could. None of what follows exists to justify staying, waiting, or hoping for a return. This isn't a roadmap back to anything. It's simply an accurate account of what tends to happen psychologically when an avoidant loses someone they never learned to hold on to properly while they had the chance. It also helps to name, directly, the widespread cultural assumption this entire exploration is working against. The idea that avoidants simply move on, effortlessly, unbothered, essentially immune to the kind of prolonged heartbreak other people experience after a significant relationship ends. This assumption isn't entirely baseless. It's built on genuine observation, the observable fact that avoidants often do appear calm, composed, and quickly functional in the immediate aftermath of a breakup, sometimes almost unsettlingly so. But appearance, as this entire exploration keeps returning to, is simply not a reliable measure of an avoidant's internal experience, and mistaking the two has caused an enormous amount of unnecessary pain for people who assumed their own suffering was somehow one-sided, based entirely on how convincingly composed the other person managed to appear. The spiral rarely begins with obvious grief, which is often the first thing that confuses people trying to imagine what an avoidant partner might be experiencing after being left. Grief, in its ordinary, recognisable form, requires access to feeling that avoidants have spent a lifetime learning to suppress, redirect, or intellectualise before it ever becomes fully conscious. So the earliest phase of this spiral tends to look less like sadness and more like a strange, disorienting kind of numbness, a flatness that avoidants themselves often mistake for being fine, for having processed the loss efficiently, for simply being the kind of person who doesn't fall apart the way others might. This numbness is not evidence of indifference. It's a defense mechanism operating exactly as designed, keeping overwhelming feeling at a safe, manageable distance, while the rest of the mind scrambles to reorganize itself around a sudden, significant absence. Underneath this numbness, though, something else is already quietly beginning. Something that will eventually surface in ways the avoidant themselves rarely expects or welcomes. Cognitively, one of the earliest signs of this spiral involves an unusual and often distressing loss of focus. Tasks that used to feel automatic suddenly require conscious effort. Concentration becomes slippery, prone to wandering toward the same handful of unresolved thoughts, regardless of what's actually being worked on. This isn't simple distraction. It reflects a mind that has suddenly acquired an enormous amount of unprocessed emotional material, with nowhere appropriate to put it. Material that keeps intruding on ordinary thought, precisely because it hasn't yet been consciously acknowledged or metabolized. Many avoidants respond to this cognitive disruption by throwing themselves harder into whatever already occupied their attention before the relationship ended. Work, hobbies, physical activity. anything that offers a sense of productivity and control. This isn't inherently unhealthy, and it can look, from the outside, like admirable resilience, someone bouncing back quickly, staying busy, refusing to let a breakup derail their life. But this apparent resilience frequently functions as another layer of avoidance rather than genuine recovery, a way of outrunning feeling rather than processing it. The busier an avoidant becomes in the aftermath of a loss like this, the more suspicious that busyness deserves to be, precisely because avoidants have spent their entire lives using productivity and self-sufficiency as a substitute for emotional processing they never learned to do any other way. There's a metaphor worth holding here. Picture someone patching a leak in a ceiling by simply painting over the water stain rather than fixing the pipe causing it. From a distance, the ceiling looks fine, maybe even freshly maintained, but the leak continues, invisibly, behind the new layer of paint, until eventually the damage becomes too extensive to hide behind cosmetic fixes any longer. This is essentially what happens when an avoidant responds to a significant loss by immediately increasing their productivity, their busyness, their outward appearance of having moved on efficiently. The underlying leak, the actual grief and reckoning the loss demands, continues regardless, hidden temporarily behind a surface that looks, for a while, entirely intact. Physically, this spiral tends to manifest in ways that surprise avoidants themselves, because their whole life has often been organised around minimising physical and emotional intensity of any kind. Sleep frequently becomes disrupted, either through difficulty falling asleep, a mind that won't quiet down enough to allow rest, or through a kind of oversleeping that functions as its own form of avoidance, an unconscious attempt to simply skip past hours that would otherwise have to be filled with unstructured, unavoidable feeling. Appetite often shifts as well, sometimes diminishing significantly, sometimes swinging toward compulsive eating, used as a substitute source of comfort. Neither pattern is universal, but some disruption to these basic physical rhythms tends to appear reliably during this period, evidence that the body is registering a level of stress the conscious mind hasn't yet fully acknowledged. There's also a specific kind of restlessness that tends to emerge, a persistent, low-grade agitation that doesn't respond well to the usual methods of self-soothing an avoidant has relied on throughout their life. Distraction, which normally works efficiently for avoidance precisely because it prevents feeling from ever fully arriving, starts to lose its effectiveness. Activities that used to reliably absorb attention stop providing the same relief. This is often deeply confusing and even frightening for someone whose entire coping structure has depended on distraction functioning as a reliable escape hatch. When that escape hatch stops working as well as it always used to, the feelings underneath begin leaking through, regardless of how much effort goes into avoiding them. As this phase continues, something more specific and more painful tends to develop, a particular kind of retrospective reckoning that avoidants rarely allow themselves to experience while a relationship is still active and available to them. Memories, previously filed away as unremarkable, suddenly acquire new weight and significance. Small moments that felt ordinary at the time get replayed with a clarity and emotional charge they never carried while they were actually happening. This retrospective reevaluation is one of the more painful and consistent features of this entire spiral, because the timing is almost always tragically backwards. The full emotional significance of what was lost only becomes accessible once accessing it can no longer change anything about how the relationship actually unfolded while it still existed. This retrospective process tends to focus disproportionately on specific kinds of memories, ones that highlight the other person's steadiness, patience, or effort. Memories that, at the time, may have been taken for granted, or even mildly resented, as demanding too much emotional engagement. In hindsight, these same qualities often become the exact things an avoidant finds themselves missing most acutely, precisely because they represent a kind of presence the avoidant is now discovering they don't know how to access anywhere else, and don't know how to provide for themselves either. For anyone listening who spent a relationship feeling as though their steadiness, patience, and effort were consistently underappreciated, met with distance rather than gratitude, there's something important buried in this pattern. The very qualities that seem to go unnoticed or unrewarded at the time are very often the specific things an avoidant ends up missing most intensely once they're gone. This doesn't rewrite the disappointment of having those qualities underappreciated while the relationship was actually happening, but it does offer a kind of delayed validation, confirmation that what was being offered mattered a great deal more than it ever appeared to in the moment. As the spiral deepens further, identity itself often becomes destabilized in ways that catch many avoidants completely off guard. For much of their adult life, avoidants tend to build an identity heavily centered on self-sufficiency, on being the person who doesn't need anyone, who handles things independently, who never becomes the kind of person consumed by longing for someone else. Losing someone significant enough to trigger a genuine spiral directly contradicts this self-concept, and the contradiction itself tends to produce a secondary layer of distress on top of the original grief. This creates a peculiar, uncomfortable double bind. The avoidant is grieving a loss they can't fully acknowledge is affecting them this deeply, because acknowledging it would require abandoning a core piece of how they've always understood themselves. So alongside the grief itself, there's often a parallel struggle with a growing, unwelcome awareness that their self-image as someone unaffected by attachment, someone who doesn't get destabilized by relationships ending, might not be entirely accurate. This identity confrontation can be more destabilizing, in some ways, than the loss itself, because it threatens the foundation the avoidant has built their entire sense of self upon. It's worth pausing here to offer something important to anyone listening who might feel tempted to interpret visible signs of this spiral as an invitation to step back in, to offer comfort, to help the avoidant process what they're going through. Watching someone struggle with an identity crisis triggered by loss is not the same as watching someone develop the actual capacity for secure, consistent intimacy. These are related, but genuinely distinct processes, and conflating them tends to produce a great deal of unnecessary heartbreak for anyone who mistakes the first for evidence of the second. As this spiral continues, many avoidants eventually attempt some form of what could be called compensatory connection, an effort to fill the space left by the relationship's absence, without actually confronting what that absence represents. This can take several forms, and it's worth naming a few without turning this into an exhaustive checklist, since the underlying function remains the same, regardless of the specific form it takes. Sometimes this shows up as an intensified focus on friendships or family relationships that had previously received less attention, a kind of overcorrection toward connection that doesn't carry the same threatening intensity as romantic intimacy did. Sometimes it shows up as pursuing new romantic connections relatively quickly, though these connections often carry a specific, recognizable quality of being used more as distraction than as genuine interest, something that becomes apparent through how little emotional depth the avoidant is actually willing to bring into them. This pattern deserves particular attention because it's often misinterpreted by people watching from the outside, including sometimes by the very person who is left. Seeing an avoidant appear to move on quickly, entering a new relationship or situation that looks superficially like evidence of having recovered easily, can be devastating to witness, especially for someone still deep in their own grieving process. But rapid rebound behaviour in avoidance is frequently not evidence of having moved on in any genuine sense. It's often precisely the opposite, a strategy for avoiding the very reckoning this entire spiral is supposed to eventually produce, a way of skipping past the discomfort of sitting with loss by immediately filling the space it left behind with something, anything, that prevents the silence from becoming too loud. There's a metaphor worth sitting with here as well. Imagine someone who has just had a structure of their home damaged significantly, and rather than repairing the actual damage, they simply move a piece of furniture in front of it, obscuring the problem from view without addressing it in any meaningful way. From the outside, the room might look complete, arranged, even pleasant, but the underlying structural issue remains exactly as damaged as it was before, quietly compromising the integrity of everything built around it. Rebound relationships in this context often function as exactly this kind of furniture, arranged quickly and visibly enough to create the appearance of having addressed a problem that, underneath, remains completely untouched. For anyone listening who has felt a particular kind of pain watching an avoidant seem to replace them with apparent ease, there's something worth holding on to here. Appearance and internal reality frequently diverge dramatically, for avoidance specifically, more so than for almost any other attachment style, because their entire coping structure has always depended on projecting competence and stability, regardless of what's actually happening internally. Someone appearing to have moved on is not reliable evidence that they actually have, and in fact, the speed and visibility of an apparent recovery often correlates more closely with the depth of what's being avoided than with genuine resolution. There's a particular feature of this spiral worth exploring in more depth because it tends to surprise avoidants more than almost anything else discussed so far, precisely because it happens entirely outside their control. Sleep, already disrupted during this period, often becomes host to a kind of intrusive mental activity that avoidants find deeply unsettling. Dreams and half-waking thoughts that return, repeatedly, to the relationship that ended, often replaying moments with a vividness and emotional intensity that feels completely disproportionate to how those same moments were experienced consciously at the time. This happens because sleep, and particularly the dreaming stages of sleep, involve significantly less activity in the parts of the brain responsible for the kind of conscious suppression avoidants rely on so heavily during waking hours. Whatever material has been pushed down, minimized, or intellectualized away during the day tends to surface far more easily once that suppression mechanism temporarily relaxes during sleep. This is why so many avoidants report a strange, uncomfortable pattern during this period. Waking up from dreams about a relationship they've spent all day insisting they've already processed and moved past, only to find themselves disoriented by how much unresolved feeling those dreams apparently still contained. For an avoidant, this experience tends to be genuinely destabilizing because it represents direct evidence, arriving from somewhere entirely outside their conscious control, that their usual defenses are not as complete or effective as they've always assumed them to be. There's no way to intellectualize a dream away in the same manner conscious thoughts can be managed and redirected. This forces a confrontation, however brief and however quickly suppressed again upon waking, with the reality that far more remains unresolved than the avoidant's daytime persona is willing to admit. This particular symptom, more than almost any other described in this exploration, tends to accumulate over time rather than fading quickly, precisely because it bypasses the very mechanisms an avoidant would normally use to process and dismiss it. Someone can spend months maintaining an outwardly composed, unaffected appearance during waking hours, while quietly, privately, experiencing a completely different internal reality every single night, one filled with unresolved longing, regret, or grief that never gets acknowledged or discussed with anyone at all. Over a longer stretch of time, sustained suppression of this magnitude tends to produce broader physical consequences as well, consequences that extend well beyond the initial weeks of disrupted sleep and appetite already described. Chronic, unresolved emotional strain has a well-documented tendency to manifest somatically, showing up as persistent tension, recurring headaches, a generally lowered tolerance for ordinary stress that wouldn't have registered as significant before. This happens because the body continues registering and responding to unresolved emotional material, regardless of whether the conscious mind has agreed to acknowledge it. And prolonged suppression essentially forces that unresolved material to find expression somewhere, often in the body rather than in conscious awareness, since conscious awareness remains the one channel avoidants are most practiced at closing off entirely. As the spiral progresses through these various stages, something particularly significant tends to emerge around comparison, an almost involuntary habit of measuring every subsequent connection against the one that was lost. This comparison rarely gets expressed openly, and it often isn't even fully conscious, but it tends to shape an avoidant's experience of new relationships in ways that quietly undermine those relationships from the start. New partners are unconsciously evaluated against a standard the avoidant themselves might not even be able to articulate clearly, a standard built from the specific combination of safety, familiarity, and depth that existed in the relationship that ended, whether or not that relationship was ever explicitly, consciously identified as significant while it was actually happening. This comparison tends to produce a particular kind of restlessness in whatever comes next, an inability to settle fully into new connections, a persistent background sense that something is missing without always being able to name what that something is. This is one of the more painful, long-term consequences of this entire spiral, because it means the loss doesn't simply resolve itself once enough time passes or once a new relationship begins. It often continues operating quietly beneath the surface of everything that follows, shaping and limiting new connections in ways the avoidant themselves may never fully understand or articulate. There's another dimension to this spiral worth examining closely, because it explains why so few people ever get an accurate picture of what an avoidant actually experiences during this period, even people who remain close to them throughout it. Avoidants, already inclined toward emotional privacy under ordinary circumstances, tend to withdraw even further during this kind of spiral, often at exactly the moment when genuine support would be most beneficial. This isn't simple shyness or a temporary preference for solitude. It reflects a deep, long-standing discomfort with being witnessed in a state of visible need. A discomfort that intensifies precisely when need is at its highest. This withdrawal often extends even to close friends and family members, people who might otherwise be well positioned to offer meaningful support. Conversations about the breakup, when they happen at all, tend to be brief, minimized, framed in terms that downplay the actual impact. We weren't right for each other. It was time to move on. Everything happens for a reason. These explanations aren't necessarily conscious lies. They're often the only version of the story an avoidant feels capable of sharing, without risking the exposure that comes with admitting how significantly they're actually struggling. The people around them, taking these explanations at face value, frequently walk away with an entirely inaccurate picture of how much distress is actually present underneath, which means the avoidant ends up navigating this entire spiral in a profound, self-imposed isolation, unsupported not because support wasn't available, but because accepting it would have required a level of visible vulnerability their defenses simply couldn't tolerate. This isolation compounds the difficulty of the spiral considerably, because processing significant loss tends to go far more smoothly when it happens within some kind of supportive relational context, whether that's friends, family, or a therapist. Attempting to process a major loss entirely alone, without any outside perspective or support, tends to prolong the process considerably and increases the likelihood that the avoidant will eventually settle into some form of chronic suppression, rather than working through the grief toward any kind of genuine resolution. This is one of the more tragic ironies embedded in avoidant psychology, that the very defense mechanisms designed to protect against emotional overwhelm often end up prolonging and intensifying exactly the kind of overwhelm they were meant to prevent, simply by cutting the avoidant off from the kind of support that might otherwise help metabolize it. There's a related pattern worth mentioning, because it explains a specific kind of behavior that can seem confusing or even alarming to anyone who happens to witness it. Some avoidants, during this period, reach for whatever numbing strategies are available to them, not necessarily in an extreme or dramatic form, but through a general increase in behaviours designed to create distance from feeling. Excessive work, excessive exercise, excessive consumption of entertainment or media. Anything that fills time and attention without requiring direct engagement with the underlying grief. This pattern deserves gentle attention rather than alarm in most cases, since it represents an extension of the same avoidance strategies already discussed throughout this exploration, simply applied more intensely during a period of heightened internal pressure. It's worth naming too the specific moments that tend to disrupt whatever equilibrium an avoidant manages to construct during this period, because these disruptions tend to follow a fairly predictable pattern, despite each individual case looking different on the surface. Certain ordinary, unremarkable circumstances, an unexpected quiet moment, an unrelated conversation that happens to touch on something adjacent to the relationship, a change in season or routine that once carried some association with the person who's gone, tend to produce sudden, disproportionate waves of feeling that catch the avoidant completely off guard. These moments are often deeply unsettling, precisely because they arrive without warning, undermining whatever sense of control and composure the avoidant has worked hard to maintain in between them. Over time, these waves often become one of the more reliable signs, to the avoidant themselves if to no one else, that whatever they've told themselves about having moved on efficiently isn't holding up as consistently as their outward presentation might suggest. There's an important distinction worth making here though, because this pattern of comparison and restlessness doesn't guarantee any particular outcome, and it shouldn't be mistaken for a promise of eventual return or reconciliation. An avoidant can spend years experiencing exactly this kind of quiet, persistent restlessness in every subsequent relationship without ever consciously connecting it to the specific loss that originally created it, and without ever developing the capacity to address it directly. Recognizing that this pattern exists is not the same as concluding it will necessarily resolve itself through any particular action, including reaching back out to whoever originally triggered it. Some avoidants carry this restlessness indefinitely, treating it as simply an unexplainable feature of their emotional life, rather than tracing it back to its actual source. As this spiral continues to unfold over an extended period, often months, sometimes years, a particular kind of exhaustion tends to set in, distinct from the earlier numbness and distinct from the identity confrontation described previously. This exhaustion comes from the ongoing effort required to maintain distance from feelings that keep insisting on being acknowledged, despite every effort to suppress or redirect them. Maintaining avoidance as a long-term strategy requires constant, if largely unconscious, effort, and that effort tends to become more difficult to sustain the longer significant, unprocessed grief remains unaddressed underneath it. This is often the point where avoidants either begin some genuine process of internal reckoning, finally allowing themselves to feel what they've been avoiding, or they settle into a kind of chronic, low-grade emotional suppression that becomes simply how they operate moving forward, an ongoing, mostly invisible cost paid quietly for the rest of their life. Which path a particular avoidant takes depends on factors largely outside anyone else's control or influence: prior history, current circumstances, whether anything in their life eventually forces the kind of confrontation this spiral was always building toward. There's no reliable way to predict which outcome will occur for any specific person, and it's important to resist the temptation to assume, based on hope or wishful thinking, that a particular avoidant will necessarily choose the path of genuine growth, rather than the path of continued, quieter suppression. There's something worth turning toward now that centers entirely on the person who left, or who was left, rather than on the avoidant's internal experience. Because so much of this exploration has understandably focused on decoding someone else's psychology. And that focus, while informative, can inadvertently keep attention fixed away from the person who actually needs it most right now. Living through a relationship with someone who struggled this deeply to express what they were actually feeling in real time takes a specific kind of toll, one that deserves acknowledgement independent of anything discussed about the avoidance spiral. It means spending a significant stretch of time genuinely uncertain about where one stood, interpreting inconsistent signals, absorbing distance without a clear explanation for it, often blaming oneself for a dynamic that had far more to do with the other person's unresolved history than with anything actually lacking in the relationship being offered. That uncertainty is exhausting in its own right, regardless of what eventually gets revealed about the avoidant's internal experience once the relationship ends. It's worth naming clearly that understanding an avoidance spiral doesn't erase the legitimacy of whatever difficulty existed while the relationship was actually happening. Both things can be true simultaneously. An avoidant partner may have genuinely struggled internally in ways that weren't visible at the time, and the experience of loving someone who couldn't express that struggle clearly may still have been genuinely painful, confusing, and worth grieving in its own right. Neither truth cancels out the other, and healing tends to go more smoothly when both are allowed to exist side by side, rather than forcing one to overwrite the other. There's also something worth saying about the particular kind of self-doubt that tends to follow relationships like this. a persistent, quiet questioning of one's own perception, wondering whether the connection was ever as real as it felt, whether the difficulty was a sign of not being loved enough, whether more patience or more effort might have produced a different outcome. This self-doubt deserves direct, unambiguous address, because it tends to be one of the most corrosive, lingering effects of loving an avoidant, and because everything explored throughout this entire spiral offers a fairly clear answer to it. The struggle described here, this entire pattern of numbness, identity confrontation, intrusive grief, and quiet isolation, doesn't happen in response to something insignificant.